pro-McCain stuff, I guess the thesis was, into his pieces. I would have thought the editors, you know, if they were halfway on their toes, if they saw some huge plug for McCain, you know, which I doubt Rosenthal would try and do, you know, they just take it out. So I think it's kind of a little bit of posturing, frankly. But there is definitely, and it was in Washington, Babylon.
Babylon, yes.
Yeah, we have a lot of that stuff where, you know, Andrea Mitchell and Greenspan and...
Howard Feynman is actually one that that you also
Yeah, I think we went up to
mentioned.
Feynman, and we said, you know, there they are. I think one of the things is that journalists, you know, when I first came to this country, I was amazed to I went on a campaign trail. I was amazed to see that they weren't drunk all the time. In England, you see the journalists are drunk a lot. I mean, Fleet Street is notorious, and correctly so. I haven't been there. I mean, you know, for boozers. You know, I mean, you're talking people like, you know, with little green things crawling up their leg in the hospital bed with the DTs. And then I got here, and I thought, I went on the train. I said to someone, at the end of the day, you know, in England, they'll all be wiped out. And in America, we were in a motel on the campaign trail, and you'd hear all the solemn voices of the radio people. This is Joe Snodgrass. You know, they were all still sober at 7 o'clock. And I eventually decided that the self-esteem of a journalist in England was like very low. As Auburn War said, you know, lower than badger gassers. I mean, you can't be lower than a guy who gasses badgers. But journalists had a low sense of esteem because they were doing things that were so odious, morally odious, like intruding, inveigling their way into people's houses and getting photographs because there was some scandal, or, you know, in the Murdoch press actually putting secret cameras behind walls and spying on people like they did with Tony Lampton, and so on and so forth. Low stuff, very low. And so naturally, in your moral self-torment, you took refuge in the bottle. And here, the self-esteem of journalists is a lot harder. They genuinely felt and feel that they have an important role to play. You know, the fearless patrol people for the First Amendment and our constitutional freedoms. And so they now, but in those days earlier on, I think journalists, Ben Bradley pointed this out one time, that, you know, it's easier to be, when you're paying very low money, as journalists pay 20, 30 years ago, was a lot lower. But when you're a major journalistic player, you're in Washington, and between you and your missus, or you and your mister, you're earning $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year. You've got a real stake in the system. You've got a fancy house. You've got to keep it all going. You know, you're pally with all the power elite, and you're not going to rock the boat. So the idea that you're a boat rocker in any way goes out the window. So you get less people, you know, who are in the established journalistic mainstream, who feel they can afford to be, or in a position to be, you know, throwing rocks at the greenhouse. That's more our role now.
I want to go back to your family a little bit. You talked a lot about Patrick. Who's your other brother?
Andrew, who lives right here in Washington, D.C., who just did this terrific book on Rumsfeld. I believe he was a guest on C-SPAN, actually.
He was, actually, yes. And this is the book, and the newest book from Patrick is The Occupation. How did all three of you end up in journalism?
Well, I referred earlier to our father Claude,
yes.
And, you know, we all admired him terrifically and thought he'd, you know, he sort of put the best cast on journalism. He said it's a crusading activity. You know, you can try and promote your ideals and put forward your ideals in your journalism. Journalism is an activist's occupation, to put it like that. And he was a very good journalist and also a terrific fellow, so we naturally admired him. And, you know, none of us became oil company executives. I'm sorry, my poor mother.
And this is the three of you at a much, much earlier age. Which one are you? How does it go down?
The creep on the left. Look
You're
at him.
the oldest, then.
Yeah, that's Patrick there at the bottom, and there's Andrew off there on the right.
Are your politics all the same?
I wouldn't want to speak for them. I mean, you know, who knows what trouble I'll get them all into. I mean, I don't think any of them will be running for, let's say, Republicans.
New York City, go ahead.
Yes, good morning, actually. I was wondering, in the 40s and 50s, communist Russia sent spies throughout the world. They created these camps emulating America. And England has a large communist party there.
Where, now or then?
Now.
I don't believe so.
What do you mean? Don't you see people, like, demonstrating, and everybody says that the communists are paying the demonstrators in England, the Communist Party.
The communists in England? I think the Communist Party in England's virtually ceased to exist.
Oh, really?
Just the same as it is here.
Do you think there are communists in New York City?
I don't know. I mean, you mean genuine communists who are didn't they all just give all their papers to some library? I thought they'd kind of given up.
No,
I mean, they've gone and moved somewhere else, but I don't think there's really a functioning CPUSA.
What I believe is that communism used illegal aliens.
Oh.
Here's an emailer. Could you comment on the demonizing of Hugo Chavez and the manipulation of his intentions in nationalizing Venezuela? How does this negatively impact the public's view of Chavez, and how does it complicate U.S.-South American relations?
Well, Chavez, the elected, I think, what is it, 3 times elected now, democratically elected president of Venezuela, has, for the first time in a very long time, been using to good and social effect the wealth of his country. Of course, it's a leading, it has a lot of oil, and it exports a lot of oil, and the price of oil is extremely high, so Venezuela's got a fair amount of money. And Chavez has gone for significant efforts at redistribution. For years, decades and decades and decades, the people who are now complaining and beefing about Chavez never said a bleat when, you know, Venezuelans' little elite and their foreign sponsors and friends, you know, looted 99.99% of the money, stole it and took it away from the people. And so here comes Chavez, and that's a significant thing that we've moved on, that I think now, you know, there he is, he's a populist leader, and he's now trying to exercise more popular control. And he's openly proclaimed, you know, his friendship and admiration for Fidel Castro, and there are signs that throughout the Latin American continent, there are countries that, you know, would like to follow in his path. The lesson here is twofold. One, you know, that for many, many years, you know, Latin America followed the neoliberal path, and the path of being, you know, following the economic, first of all, in the Kennedy era and before the Eisenhower era, if you were a reformer, just a reformer, let's say in Guatemala, other countries, you know, the CIA conspired with the right-wing elites in your country to get you thrown out, either killed or run out of the country. And this went on, whether it was in Guatemala in the 50s, or right through the attempts to overthrow Castro in the late 50s under both Eisenhower and Kennedy, and then, you know, endless interventions and so forth, and of course the onslaught on Allende in 1972 in Chile by Nixon Kissinger. Politically and economically, that whole model, the model was neoliberal. You know, that if you sell off all your public resources, the phone company, the oil well, the gas company, even they made an effort at one point, the rainwater that actually drips into your rain tank, that was in Bolivia, and sell them off to foreign corporations, hook your currency to the dollar, all will be well. Well, it wasn't well. The whole thing ran into the sun. I mean, in the end of the 90s, Argentina, which was meant to be the most obedient neoliberal partner, they know the dollar and their own currency was hooked, everything was hooked, everything was going to be hunky-dory, the country went broke. And the president and the Minister of Economics had to flee across the border, pursued by most of the, you know, in spirit, and by the Argentinian people, who said this was a complete disaster. So that model ran into the sand. And so what we see now is countries saying there must be another way. Same way at the other end of the world, you know, people will say there's a better way than going into debt to the multinational institutions like, you know, the IMF and the big international institutions, which of course ultimately controlled by, you know, European and American banks. You know, there's a better way to run our destinies. And that's what's happened in Latin America. Chavez, of course, is then, you know, victim of life. They tried to have a coup in 2002, and it's encouraging that they failed miserably. The coup, it was a disaster. And Chavez survived. They didn't manage to shoot him. And he came back, and he's prevailed against all opposition. But obviously they say here, you know, this is the blood-stained visage of a tyrant, or a prospective tyrant, and he's another Fidel Castro, and the rest of it. What do you expect? He's actually, after all, donating cheap home heating oil to poor communities in the American Northeast. It's kind of humiliating that, you know, you have poor people who can't get cheap energy or home heating oil locally, so Citgo, which is the Venezuelan-owned entity here, is making available low-cost oil in certain neighborhoods. It's kind of a slap in the face for Uncle Sam.
Boise, Idaho, you're next. Hello.
Hello. I wanted to say good afternoon, Mr. Cockburn, and I'm a longtime Nation subscriber, and I look forward to your column every week. I may not always agree with your views, but they're always thoughtful and insightful, and I thank you for them. And there were two things I wanted to ask you about today. The first is what I would call the dismemberment of civil liberties in this country under this administration, and the fundamental changes in the bureaucratic structure of our government, and exactly how dangerous do you think this is? The second would be your views on impeachment of this president, and in particular maybe the articles I read in The Nation from Elizabeth Holtzman concerning impeachment. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your kind words in Idaho there. On the constitutional issues, yeah, there have been some very, very serious things that have happened in the Bush era. Although I should say that a lot of stuff that went into the Patriot Act was stuff that the Justice Department in Clinton era, had already on the desk. The Justice Department is always looking, to keep up the pressure to try and reduce what they regard as inconvenient constitutional protections and so forth. And of course, it's really come to a situation of very profound crisis in the Bush era, on matters of, but it's been under pressure for a long time. If you look at the Bill of Rights, the right to a speedy trial. You have people who, it wasn't just beginning in the Bush time, spend years waiting for trial. We'll leave aside cruel and unusual punishment and the death penalty stuff. The justice system is under terrible stress and abuse, and has been for a long time. The whole plea bargaining system is complete outrage, where they throw the book at you and they say you're only going to get 35 years in prison unless you plead it out at a lower rate. And then your lawyer finally says, don't go into, if you go down, if you go non-guilty and you go down, you could be away for a quarter of a century or the rest of your life. So you better take the 8 years that they're offering you. And it's all, the prosecutors just put them through. I have none sympathy for any of these prosecutors that you're now making such a fuss about. I mean, Gonzalez seems to have, as his aide said, not been accurate in his statements, to use his word directly. But the idea that I think the Democrats, in a way, they're glad to get a subject which has nothing to do with Iraq. So they're concentrating on the Gonzalez affair, but every administration has used, appoints U.S. attorneys politically. They all do it. Clinton people did it, and so forth. But Idaho, you're completely right in saying now you've got the Military Commissions Act, you've got, gradually the Posse Comitatus Act of the 19th century for prohibiting the use of armed forces in law enforcement domestically. That's being pushed off the board. You've got, the ability for the feds to call on National Guards in ways they couldn't before. Right through, starting with habeas corpus, it's a terrible, terrible affront to constitutional liberty, and you'll find as many people on the so-called right in the, in the libertarian camp or in the constitutional camp pointing this out, and sometimes more so, I might say, than on the left. That's point one. Now, point two, I've talked so long about point one, I can't even remember point two.
It was about impeachment.
Well, we have a lot of writers on our website who've gone on impeachment, starting with our good friend Dave Lindorf, who has written a book about it. I mean, I have to confess, I think there would be grounds for impeachment. I personally take the view that every president should face impeachment probably halfway through their first term, and it should be an ongoing process. So I'm not against impeachment. I tend to think, and I don't want to, put down the pro-impeachment forces, and Dave writes a piece about every other week saying, the tide is turning, we've got impeachment coming over the horizon. I don't think it's kind of on the boards myself, and people invest in a way too much hope in it as the salve. People are always looking for things to unlock the system. So when impeachment comes, by golly, then we'll get rid of the fellow. Impeach